Hey guys, this is Mountain Walk, and today we're going to be talking a little bit about Mirrodin. Yep, that's right. We got another one of these X set is nuts. So instead of like Mercadian Masks, where I was trying to convince you that the set's actually pretty ridiculous, this is sort of the exact opposite, because everyone knows that Mirrodin is pretty good, right? Not much of a stretch there. Don't have to do much convincing. I think I've already convinced you. But it does have a lot of other things going on, and I really would like to outline the way that it sort of changed, like standard, and then also older formats, and sort of just everything sort of about the game really changed and became more recognizable to what we see today, with like the modern card frame and everything else. So let's get into it. Let's get yourself a nice drink. You know, grab yourself a cup of coffee if it's in the morning. I don't know, whatever. So let's go ahead and get into it. All right. First things first. The biggest difference, of course, is the card face change. I believe 8th edition came out first, like in the summer. Then Mirrodin came out in the fall. But this is really big, especially since it was first artifact set in a while. So you have all these artifacts that are silver; they're not brown. I mean, this bugs me. This drove me nuts the last 17 years. I can't. I hate it. I'll never like it. I'll never. Well, I don't like it as much, at least, as the old mono brown stuff, because those felt like artifacts, right? Like these are dusty old things, and you got spell books and everything else, and it feels old and sweet. You feel like a wizard, right? The new stuff is just too shiny and chrome, and I mean, at least it fits in as much as that Karn, the Silver Golem, creates Argentum, later Mirrodin, and it's all shiny and silver and stuff because it's new. So, I mean, I guess there is something there, but um, I'm not gonna like it. I'm not gonna like it. So we also got a new artifact subtype, which was equipment. This is a big thing. This was kind of a um, they weren't able to like do like they had like swords and shields and stuff like that back in the day, but they obviously weren't equipment. They didn't really function like equipment. They would be like, oh, this thing remains tapped to do X, Y, Z or something, and it didn't really work, and it was kind of awkward. So they sort of made the equipment thing work. This is one of the most important types of cards, I guess subtypes that they've added. Not the most important one, which I'll do a video on probably a lot later, but it made deck building interesting. Artifact synergies became important for decks that maybe wouldn't consider them. So that's pretty interesting, and it's basically the beginning of the modern era of Magic. Like I said, the cards. This is if you see the new card face versus the old card face, the new card face for gosh maybe 80-90% of players or something, that's the one that is familiar to them. They don't, the old card face, they don't have any sort of attachment or fondness for, at least not from like nostalgia. Um, and also, it's literally the beginning of Modern, since Modern begins at 8th edition as well as, Mirrodin itself, and that goes forward. Also, by this point, the color pie has more or less been figured out. We aren't going to see too many changes really in the future. Nothing very crazy. For example, by this point, red has the ritual effects. Black doesn't really get them. That kind of thing. So yeah, everything's sort of coalescing around what we would really expect to see from like a typical Magic set these days, and I think Mirrodin is basically the best example of that. So yeah, let's move on. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at the mechanics of this set. And these things are, well, they're pretty good. So there were three mechanics: affinity, imprint, and entwine. Obviously, I mean, wow, what do you need to say about affinity? Well, let me think. It was busted. It was very good. And it's only recently, now being 2020, has been power creeped and or banned out of the formats where it's really good in. So for example, in Modern, Mox Opal got banned, which really hurt the affinity style decks, as well as uh, all the artifact lands are banned, as well as Skull Clamp is banned. So not only has the deck been power creeped, finally, it's also just been banned to death. So, rip. Um, yeah, it hasn't really gotten a ton of really like super important cards like Mox Opal, well, since Mox Opal, really. So that's unfortunate. So any sort of affinity style decks aren't that great anymore, but it did take them nearly 20 years. So I guess that's pretty good, right? Um, but yeah, a lot of these things are just typically causing all sorts of havoc and problems in all sorts of formats because A, free spells are just ridiculous, even when they're only attached to, say, a grizzly bear, for example. Um, but yeah, it's pretty busted. You know, stuff like Thoughtcast, for example, being a one mana, draw two cards. Uh, Pretty good rate, right? So yeah, lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of good stuff. Like I mean, I can't even say. I'm honestly sort of at a loss for words because what more can I add to the conversation? Affinity was busted. It was busted then. It's busted now. Uh, it'll, it's one of those mechanics like Storm and Dredge that they'll probably really not print anything for. I mean, we might see something in another Modern Horizons, which would be kind of nice. But yeah, so definitely a big mistake, and obviously caused a lot of issues with the rest of the format and the game in general. In fact, so much so. Well, we'll talk about that when we get there. Moving on, we got imprint, and pretty much the best thing when I think of imprint, I think of Chrome Mox. There was other things that you could do with imprint, like for example, Isochron Scepter was another just as powerful and just as good. Uh, but it, you know, obviously it played in different decks. But Chromox is the one I think of the most. I mean, this card is absolutely busted. Still banned, of course, in Modern, and it was saw a ton of play in Standard and pretty much every format. Was restricted in Vintage in 2003, I think, into 2003, or gosh, maybe it was earlier than that. I can't quite remember, but yeah, it was restricted and recently-ish unrestricted. Um, but yeah, so the imprint things didn't do as good because they were obviously card disadvantage, but some of them were pushed pretty hard, um, and that made them very, very strong. Entwine, there was some good entwine stuff, but the biggest one, of course, that saw the play for the most amount of time was Tooth and Nail, of course, whether in block, standard, or extended, or whatnot. And this let you get all sorts of like two card combos. Like sometimes you just get like uh like Kiki Jiki and like Darksteel Colossus or whatever, and just like attack you with a Darksteel Colossus, just silly stuff. But you could do a lot, and there's all sorts of combos that were played. Um, so yeah, this is pretty much the best one if we're thinking about like what is the best like entwine spell. I think there were others. There was what was the one that I think destroyed a land and searched for a land? Gosh, I can't remember the name. Oh, I really should have this on lockdown, but that's okay. That's okay. Most of this stuff not that important anymore. So, okay. So let's move on. We got more mechanics. Apparently Darksteel has mechanics. Oh boy, I just saw that typo. That's embarrassing. That's embarrassing. I better drink, otherwise I'll just kill myself. All right, so Darksteel had two mechanics. The introduction of indestructible and modular. Indestructible, well, does exactly what it says. Um, Most famously on something like Darksteel Colossus, which was totally insane. When anyone saw it, they pretty much died because it was amazing. I remember people going absolutely totally nuts over this card. Um, I was like, wow, this is big. So it was pretty cool, pretty cool. Everyone likes Darksteel Colossus. And then, of course, you have modular. This was really was what made a lot of the affinity stuff pretty good and made the deck very resilient to removal. Maybe it wasn't exactly Arcbound Worker that did it, but you get the point. Um, Worker was an excellent role player in the affinity deck, and so basically, when it dies, you can put the 1/1 counter on a different artifact creature, so that was great. You could sometimes put it on like your Blink Moth Nexus, and like the counters would stay on it even when it wasn't a creature, which is great. So it gave you protection from like sorcery speed stuff, pretty sweet. Then Fifth Dawn also had two mechanics, Sunburst and Scry. The probably the best Sunburst. Well, I mean, the only one that really saw that much play was engineered explosives, a new sort of take on powder keg and stuff. Um, so yeah, this thing is sweet. Still sees tons of play. What a great card. Um, Kills all sorts of nasty stuff. Hits non-land permanents, so this can hit like enchantments and planeswalkers too. Pretty nice. And then we have Scry, which is, well, I mean, everyone knows what Scry does at this point. A lot of these mechanics are evergreen. For example, Scry and Indestructible are now evergreen mechanics, and some stuff is, there's a lot more Indestructible stuff in white, and then blue gets a lot more Scry stuff. But I think a lot of these are available to most colors. Yeah, so they really hit it out of the park with the mechanics in this set. Sunburst was, maybe not the best, but Engineered Explosives made pretty good use of it. Um, so that's pretty sweet. Obviously, Scry is very very good. Gives card manipulation to. Obviously, blue gets the most of it, but it is available to other colors, which is pretty sweet. Pretty sweet. So whenever any other color gets a Scry card, that's pretty nice. So yeah, and obviously, like, yeah, Indestructible also another one. That one doesn't. That one's kind of like been sort of a replacement for Regeneration, which is whatever, but definitely pretty interesting, and a very well beloved mechanic. Okay, so let's go over some of the notable cards from these sets. So we'll start off with Mirrodin. First and foremost, Broodstar, baby. That's the first thing I think of. I love Broodstar. This is like the first affinity decks were Broodstar affinity decks. They were just play a bunch of random crap, build up to your Broodstar, and go nuts. Like, that was awesome. Um, yeah, this thing is sweet. It's a beast, another blue beast. They had so many blue beasts in Onslaught. I guess they wanted to continue the trend. So we have more blue beasts in Mirrodin. So there you go. This thing is sweet and huge, and you can't really go wrong. It's hilariously fun. Um, Obviously, the Broodstar decks weren't really the problem with Affinity. That came a little bit later. Next, we have Cloudpost. Yeah, this card's pretty good. A lot of it was future printings or synergy with older cards. Obviously, Sylvan Scrying was in this set too, which let you get your Cloudpost. But in older formats, you had stuff like crop rotation and such. Um, a lot of Cloudpost, obviously Cloudpost power was very dependent upon future printings. So Glimmerpost and Scars, as well as like Vesuva and Time Spiral, gave you the full 12 posts. Um, but it obviously still played. Still pretty sweet card, pretty powerful. Speaking of mana ramp, of course, Seething Song, again, another banned card, same as Cloudpost. Very, very good. Sees play in mostly just like Storm style decks, but also a lot of Big Red style decks. Also played that in Standard and in other formats too. Second Sunrise, yeah, that's another banned card. This was mostly because of the Krark Clan Ironworks decks in Modern, but it also saw play in older versions of the AX decks, even around like 2006, I think. And then, of course, uh, last but certainly not least, is Chalice of the Void. Extremely powerful lock piece, very, very cheap. Um, Gives you the ability to interact with a lot of decks. For example, in Vintage, you could drop Chalice on 0 after you drop all your Moxen, and then your opponent can drop their Moxen. So it's sort of like a tempo tool, or it can be an actual lock piece if you cast it for 1, draw to stop them from casting their 1-cost spells, obviously. This card has been very, very dominant in older formats, especially since they have more compacted mana curves typically. Looking at like a lot of the blue decks with stuff like Swords, Bolts, Duress Thoughtseize, Brainstorm, Ponder, all that kind of stuff. And Chalice stops them cold. It's another great anti-combo card. I mean, the thing does everything. Love Chalice of the Void. I know a lot of people hate it, but yeah, you can't really deny this card's raw power. I mean, absolutely, absolutely game breaking. Okay, so there's a lot of other stuff too. So we got Siege of Synod, which was um, one of the 5 artifact lands from Mirrodin. And this thing was great. This was awesome in the affinity decks, all sorts of other synergies with artifacts too, since it was a cheap artifact and it didn't really take up space in your deck, which was really nice. And then we have Solemn Simulacrum. This is Jen's Thorin's invitational card. And this thing was pretty sweet. This is, I mean, one of the probably one of the premier like casual player cards. It was good in Standard. It was pretty much good every time it was in Standard. It's one of the better cards in Commander, one of the more played ones. It gets you all sorts of synergy from blinking or sacking it, or it's just a random blocker, artifact synergies. I mean, everything. This card does it all. It's pretty sweet. I love it. And I like the art. Look at him. He's solemn. Anyways, Duplicant. Again, another card that saw some play in Standard. A lot of the Crystal Shard decks played Duplicant. Also another card I like playing in Commander. I remember a particular game of Commander when I was playing. This is a long time ago, years ago. And my friend was uh, bouncing Duplicant with Crystal Shard like for 10 turns in a row, just killing every creature on the board. It was the funniest thing, and all the other players were just like getting really upset. I just laughed. It was the funniest shit ever. It was just like, I mean, obviously it's just hilarious. Freaking Duplicant answers anything. Amazing. Amazing. Then we got Platinum Angel and Bosch. These are excellent tinker targets, and just really showcase that, yeah, creatures are a lot better than they were back in the day. Trying to think of like good creatures back in the day, don't even exist really. There's like 10 or something, right? And you got stuff like Platinum Angel. It's like, oh, you can't lose the game, your opponent can't win the game. Ridiculous. What a crazy card when I first saw it. Bosch, of course, is just a huge beater. He has trample, and then he can sacrifice crap, um, either himself or others, to kill people, which is awesome. Totally sweet, totally sweet. All right, so we got Goblin Char Belcher. So this really started a couple different combo decks. Obviously, the Belcher decks in like Legacy and Vintage to play 1 or 2 lands. Also, there was the Tinker Severance Belcher, so you played Mana Severance, remove all your lands, and then you obviously would activate your Belcher and deal a quadrillion damage. Then we have a bunch of the affinity stuff. Obviously, Thoughtcast and Mirror Enforcer. Again, I mean, these cards are super, like 5 mana draw 2 cards, not good, but obviously like 1 mana draw 2 is very good. How about 2 mana for 4/4? Pretty good. Or free in Mirrodin Force's case sometimes. So yeah, I mean, what more do you need to say? Thirst for Knowledge. Now this was a card that was super busted in Vintage for a very long time before it got restricted. Then there was also in the Tinker decks, of course, in Extended. Thirst was very, very good there. And Disciple of the Vault. This card was really, really good in Affinity because what happened is people wouldn't be able to just wrath you to kill all your stuff because they would die. Like if they're at 10 or less life, basically turned off all their wrath effects because you just start sacking stuff or whatever, and then your artifacts would die. Um, they would just die. They would die, and it would be sad for them. So yeah, Disciple was really, really brutal. Eventually banned too. Yeah, this card is really, really good. It was basically a 1 mana colorless fireball. Dealt a ton of damage. Pretty crazy. Pretty crazy. Alright. Now we've got one of the better Stone Rains. Molten Rain still sees some play in Modern. A pretty nice sideboard card. Destroys lands, makes them take 2 damage if they're non-basic. Pretty sweet. Not much else to say there. Sees and saw a lot of play. Slith Firewalker. This was a pretty sweet card in the big red decks. Gives you be able to go Chrome Mox, Mountain, turn 1 Slith Firewalker, attack. I mean, that thing is sweet. That was always fun. I always liked doing that. That was a sweet deck. Crystal Shard. There were decks in Block and Standard that played it, but obviously one of my favorite cards in Commander that I always try and put in my blue decks. Then we have Arc Slogger. Not really a card that sees a lot of play, but obviously a big deal in Standard and Block back in the day. Red didn't really get very many big creatures, and this was a big creature that had an upside too of just shocking stuff, which is great. And then of course our good friend Shrapnel Blast. Again, this is a sweet card. I mean, obviously the rate on this thing is pretty nuts. 2 mana, 5 damage, instant speed is great. This thing's like freaking Fire Blast 2.0, right? So yeah, it's super sweet. Shrapnel Blast still sees a lot of play, like in the Is It in Soul decks, in Pioneer. Those decks are sweet. I mean, this is just a sweet card. Who doesn't like Shrapnel Blast? The thing is awesome. I mean, shoot. All right. So this is when shit hits the fan. This is when things go a little sideways. Darksteel was released, and we got a whole bunch of shit. So this caused all sorts of issues. So first and foremost, Arcbound Ravager came out, and this really revolutionized the affinity decks. So they became a lot lower to the ground, a lot more resilient to removal, just due to modular, be able to sack stuff the way, sacking artifacts obviously combos very well with Disciple of the Vault or multiple Disciple of the Vaults. Yeah, just really ramped up your it's just another insane payoff for the artifact style decks. I mean, what more can you say about this guy? Aether Vial. This quickly saw play and was adopted in the affinity decks, and then eventually it took a little while for it to be adopted in some of the other decks back in the day. First and foremost in Goblins, and then in stuff like Death and Taxes a couple years later, forming like the Vial Waste Port sort of core. Skull Clamp. I mean, this thing broke everything in short order. Absolutely insane. We'll talk a little bit more about it later, but yeah, Skull Clamp was from Darksteel, and it was played in the affinity decks. Yeah. Then we have stuff like Sword of Fire and Ice. This thing wasn't really super broken back in the day, but I mean, obviously, like the format wasn't really about getting hits in with swords equipped to creatures too much. It was either going really big with like the Tooth and Nail decks, or like killing everything with like the big red decks, or like going super low to the ground with the affinity decks. So Sword of Fire and Ice didn't see a lot of play then, but Fire and Ice and Light and Shadow, obviously very, very good cards. See a ton of play in commander decks, like in Voltron style stuff, or of course, in like any deck with Stoneforge. They'll probably want to play some number of the swords, Light and Shadow, Fire and Ice, any of the new ones, whatever, you know. And then of course we have Trinisphere. Yeah, this thing pretty busted vintage. We'll go over that a little bit later too. But yeah, the thing's nuts. Freaking nuts. Okay, we got even more cards. So, we got a couple sweet lands. So we got Blinkmoth Nexus. This thing was sweet. Great home for counters from Ravager or any of your other modular guys. Another attacker. Basically a free roll to put into your mana base because you didn't really have super strict color requirements. And it was pretty sweet. It was a super sweet card. I love it. One of my favorite cards. I guess I have a lot of favorite cards, but I love Blinkmoth Nexus. That's a sweet card. And then of course Darksteel Citadel, an indestructible artifact land. Can't go wrong. Next we have Sundering Titan. This thing saw a lot of play in the Tinker decks. A lot of play in Vintage, which was, well, awesome because it was pretty good synergy or negative synergy. It just shit on dual lands. That's what I'm really trying to say. And of course, this thing was banned in Commander because this thing is hilarious to blink and cast and reanimate and so on and so forth. Yeah, this thing is sweet. So dang it, I can't play Sundering Titan Commander. This game's stupid. But what I can play in Commander is Darksteel Forge and Mycos Inflatus. So these are sweet. This is a classic combo. This made all of your stuff like immune to being destroyed, which is great, obviously. Made it indestructible. But it also was super sweet with Nevendrel's Disc. So you can disc every turn, because this doesn't have you sacrifice it. It just destroys itself as part of its effect, which is awesome. So that's one of my favorite combos, was disking people over and over again with Forge and Lattice. That was hilarious. I mean, there's nothing better than that. And of course, very recently, Lattice was banned in Modern because of its combo with Karn the Great Creator, basically turning off all your opponent's stuff, making them not able to play spells. And of course, this is still something you do in Legacy and Vintage. Well, Legacy. Vintage, Karn's restricted, but whatever. So anyways, all sorts of broken stuff. Alright, so now we get to 5th Dawn. So this is even more ridiculous stuff. So what do we got here? We got Crucible. This thing is sweet. This is again another lock piece. I've seen tons of play in all sorts of different decks. Basically, and it never does anything good. Well, okay, sometimes it's just like, oh, I'll replay my fetch lands or something, but typically this guy is paired up with Wasteland or something similar. Eternal Witness. This is one of the best green creatures, at least in Commander. One of the most played cards in Commander. This thing, I think it's like still top 10 last time I checked. Pretty close. This thing is super amazing because it's super cheap. It regrows. It's a body, so you can do sack and recurve and blink and all sorts of stuff like that. Does everything as sweet Therese Nielsen art. Look at that lady. Amazing. This is great. I love it. I mean, what more can you say? It was great in Standard. It saw play in the slide decks, the green-white slide decks. That was pretty awesome. It was really good in Extended at the time, the rock decks, recurring duress and especially Cabal Therapy. Totally nuts. Or just recurring any like, your Diabolic Edicts or something. Eternal Witness, pretty sweet. Even saw play in, gosh, I think it was in Vintage. There was like a dragon loop with Eternal Witness and like Ancestral Recall, and I think you would just like mill your opponent out with Ancestral. Trying to remember, yeah, something like that. Pretty crazy, right? Okay, so when 5th Dawn came out, Skull Clamp was banned. But then they immediately replaced it with cranial plating. Obviously, Cranial plating is less busted than skull clamp, but everyone was sort of like slapped their heads because it was just sort of like, shit, this thing's still around. This deck's gonna still be ridiculous. Yeah. So yeah, plating definitely sped the deck up even more. Pretty insane. I mean, yeah, that's a good card. It's one of the biggest and best payoffs for the Affinity deck. Mm. Now we got Ironworks. Again, most of you familiar with Modern are familiar with this deck. There was also another version of the deck, which we'll go into a little bit later, in Block, which I thought was sweet, and I loved it. But yeah, this is a sweet card. It gives you a lot of mana for very little cost, which is sweet. And then of course we got Magma Jet. This is an awesome burn spell. I love playing with Magma Jet. I just love the Scry too in like a deck like Sly or Burn or whatever, because it was just so good. Just getting rid of those just crap on top, drawn into actual action. Very nice. Magma Jet, what a sweet card. I love it. And it really showed off the strength of Scry. You could just put it on all sorts of stuff and it would just be awesome. Absolutely awesome. All right. Then we got even more stuff. Vildalkin Shackles. Yeah, this card, big part of Standard back in the day. I think it was mostly in like the mono blue decks. I can't remember if it's like, yeah, the mono blue decks around like Mirrodin Champions block was when I remember seeing a lot of Vildalkin Shackles. Cards pretty unfun to play against. Um, Actually, my best memory of playing with Vildalkin Shackles was actually when it was reprinted in Modern Masters, the first one. Yeah, I don't even think I lost a game. I mean, it was absolutely like, it's impossible to lose with this card. It was like even just a random two-color deck with like random cards, and it was like fine, but every time I played Shackles, like people just couldn't do it. Like, I think there was maybe like one or two cards that actually killed Voldalkin Shackles in the deck, and someone played one on me. And I played a counter spell. It was just like, it was just yeah. It was funny because it's like, man, this thing is not even close to being balanced. This is one of the stupidest draft cards I've ever played with, and I played with like GT and stuff. Like this is almost worse in some respects because um, it's just so hard to answer, and like there's just no trades you can make with this card unless you're actually killing the thing itself. Because you just start running your own creatures and your own creatures, and it's just it's miserable. So this thing is really good in draft. That was probably the only blight upon that draft format. Was Shackles. At least it was a mythic rare, but yeah, this thing's pretty busted when you don't have like stuff like Shatter and all over the place. Then we got Auriok Champion. This has been a pretty popular sideboard card against the red decks for basically forever. Still sees play in like human stacks and stuff in the sideboard and other places in Modern. Pretty nice. Auriok Salvagers. This has been a combo card in Legacy since the beginning. Obviously, the combos with Lion's Eye Diamond, of course, generating a bajillion mana and then pumping that all into Spell Bomb or something. Pretty sweet. Also sees play too in Vintage occasionally. Trinket Mage. This saw pretty much a lot of play pretty much everywhere, really. And also still sees quite a bit of play in a Commander. Lets you get your Tormod script, which I love. Stuff like Graft Digger's Cage, things like that. Other utility artifacts. Fixes your mana with artifact lands. Definitely can get stuff like Sensei's Divining Top, which is pretty sweet. I mean, really, just all sorts of stuff. And then Veldalkin or Orrery. This is, of course, just basically a commander card. Um, and it's one I like to play because, well, I like having Flash. Flash is sweet. So, yeah. Yeah. All right. So, looking over at Extended, which is where these sets really caused the most problems. In 2002, there was no bannings, pretty much, and extended, so things were looking kind of calm. Around 2003, though, obviously with like the rest of Mirrodin block being released, so you have the rest of the Goblin deck stuff, then you have all the Storm stuff coming in Scourge. Eventually ended up breaking extended pretty quickly too. So what they ended up doing was banning Lackey, um, and so rip Lackey. So in September we get rid of Lackey and Tomb because the Benzo decks, which were basically Reanimator, but with Vampiric Tutor and some other stuff, and then Frantic Search. So these were hopefully make the format a little bit slower. But in October is when Mirrodin was released. So what ended up happening? Well, uh, things broke. Things broke pretty hard. Um, so what happened is there was a lot of mana acceleration in this set. So you have all the affinity stuff, okay. You have Chromox, okay. You have Seething Song, okay. Then you have Cloud Post. So these are all eventually, some obviously more than others. Seething Song and Cloud Post would end up breaking stuff much later, obviously in modern, and then just as more stuff was printed. But obviously Affinity and Chromox specifically broke things pretty quickly, pretty fast. Because if you look at the older sets, so say we're looking at Urza's Saga, we have all sorts of stuff. We have Thran Dynamo, we have Voltaic Key and Grim Monolith, we have Metalworker, and then in older sets we have, Ancient Tomb and City of Traders and stuff like that. But really, we don't really have a lot of really great payoffs. I mean, sure, Phyrexian Colossus is pretty good with like Voltaic Key. I mean, yeah, it works, but um, compared to the stuff in Mirrodin block, just even in the first set, I mean, it's not even close. Not even close. So yeah, I think of it as like if Urza's block was like Chad, and then Mirrodin block was Stacy. Obviously, the Chads and the Stacys always get together, and it's always horrible for everyone else. Everyone's very sad and jealous. So maybe that's a weird analogy, but yeah, Mirrodin block basically had all the ridiculous payoffs that just weren't there because of power creep and changing design constraints. And Urza's block and Tempest block and older blocks still had, for some reason, some of this shit. I mean, somehow Ancient Tomb is still there. um, all sorts of other busted stuff, Metalworker, Grim Monolith, Voltaic Key, all still there. I mean, even after like 10 or 20 bans, we still have all this insanity from the first years of Magic. And so obviously combining these things had an enormously negative effect on the game as a whole, extended especially. Really, really, really broke everything. Um, oops. Fucking oops. So, yeah. Basically, this really, really changed everything. So, obviously, all the things I'd mentioned earlier, we really see like power creep on like big creatures, which have no drawbacks and only like all upsides, of course, because they're so difficult to get into play. Um, and then with certain things like in older formats where you have these classic sort of weenie decks and stuff are pushed out due to things like Chalice of the Void. And then, of course, things like Aether Vial, which quickly became part of a lot of the sort of not the new sort of creature decks. Obviously, some tribal based like goblins, some like Death and Taxes, which are more based on just onboard interactions and stuff like that. Um, so you really see a lot of churn, a lot of things like falling by the wayside very, very quickly. And back in the day, I mean, 2003, the internet was still in its infancy. There wasn't as much communication. I mean, cell phones were around, but obviously this was quite a few years before smartphones, where all over the place before they were ubiquitous. That was, but even still with this lack of really interconnectedness, Mirrodin broke everything, and everything changed very, very quickly, almost overnight. It feels like. Um, uh, Things like Chrome Mox, for example, sped up a ton of different decks. And basically what ended up happening is it almost nearly killed the game again. Not as bad as Saga Block, of course, because you still had games resembling Magic. And actually, even a lot of the stuff, say, for example, with Skull Clamp enabled like 4 different decks. And they were all like interesting and fun to play, but it pushed out anything that couldn't obviously abuse Skull Clamp as these big 3, like the Alpha Nail decks, Goblins, and then of course Affinity itself. So yeah, but people liked it. I mean, regardless of how busted it was, people liked the a lot of that kind of stuff. Um, but the game again was really really fast, and perhaps a little bit too fast for standard, and certainly for extended. All right, so gotta take another drink. I'm drinking. This is great. I'm having fun. And we got like a million more things to go. Oh. Okay, so one of the things um, that we really got really big change was Isochron Scepter, and this changed a lot of the say typical like blue white like dirtily kind of draw go control decks into basically combo control decks. Um, Scepter Chant was one of the most miserable decks to play against because it's not like they could really kill you very fast. You know, just chant you during your upkeep with Kicker over and over and over again. It was just brutal, not fun. Well, I mean, it was kind of fun. I like that kind of stuff, but it was even for me, it was a little much because it was just super easy to assemble. The rest of the deck was still good without Isochron Scepter and Chant. You could still Scepter up like a Fire and Ice or Counterspell, Mana Leak, stuff like that. Yeah, there was just thinking about playing against that deck on Magic Online was I don't really want to I don't want to talk about it. Okay, so there was also a lot of new combo decks created. Belcher, Bomberman, and Ironworks, of course, all came from this time. I mean, you can kind of count Affinity as like an aggro combo deck too. And of course, like we had mentioned, Affinity was probably going to be a big problem everywhere. Um, and Extended, well, as we had mentioned, probably not going to end up so well. So I wonder what happened to Extended. Well, Tinker happened. And they sort of knew that when they were designing Mirrodin, they're like, well, shit. I mean, some of this stuff might break with Tinker, but let's just print it and we'll see what happens. And yeah, so it's probably I think that what R&D did was fine. Obviously, Tinker is the problem. It wasn't these other cards. Tinker is one of the most busted spells ever printed, at least top 10, maybe top 5, depending on how we're ordering like Moxes and Lotus and stuff like that. Um, but yes, this card is not reasonable. Even with like just random stuff, you're just like, I'm just getting a Mishra's Helix or whatever. I mean, it does so much. Cheats on mana, tutors it, puts it into play. I mean, totally nuts. Like this card is completely obscene, and it's obviously no wonder. Looking at all like the stuff, like putting your Platinum Angels or Mind Slavers or Bosches into play or whatever. So 7 of the top 8 decks of Pro Tour New Orleans of 2003, which was that November, I think. 7 of the top 8 were Tinker decks, and the last deck was a Psychotog deck that also had to play Chromox, and it was super teched out to beat the Mirror. Like played main deck Boomerang for fuck's sake. Yeah, so I'm pretty sure that guy still made the wrong choice though. He probably just should have played a Tinker deck. But that's not all though. In fact, there was other combo decks. So Goblins was still around, still busted with all this stupid mana ramp, and then also their access to Food Chain. Even though Lackey was gone, they still had access to Recruiter. It seems kind of backwards, you think, but nope, that was still busted. And in fact, it was a big thing. The Japanese team, I believe, during the Pro Tour, had their tech leaked. Um, and I think there was a guy from Israel that was also playing the deck, and he shared it with some people. Anyways, it was a big thing that the deck was leaked, and so people knew what they were playing. Because, like I said, back in the day, there wasn't as much communication, and so people were sort of knew what to expect. Um, but yeah, so that deck didn't do as good. It obviously didn't make top eight. And then of course there was the Hermit Druid decks that played. I think they were the Suture Ghoul versions, and they had the Dragon's Breath, the one that gave him haste, the enchantment that comes back, that whole thing. Yeah, so none of those decks did that great, um, but they were still pretty ridiculous, even in comparison with the Tinker decks. And this is, of course, this is Tempest through Mirrodin in Extended. Extended had just rotated recently, so there was no Force of Will, no other good cards like Swords and Plowshares, things like that. Um, so next month in December, they got Recruiter, Grim Monolith, Tinker, Druid, Ancient Tomb, and Oath of Druids banned. Oath of Druids just because it was just an obnoxious card to play against. It's even back in the day with not very good stuff. I mean, obviously, like when Darksteel was released, you don't really want to play against like Oath into like Darksteel Colossus or something. Like that's not exactly fun. So yeah, lots of ridiculous stuff. Probably one of the most uh, broken times in Magic because you're combining like one of the few times where you really have like um, this meeting of two different things, like of the insanity of the early parts of the game where we had all this ridiculous mana ramp and things like that, but it was kind of counterbalanced by not really having great stuff to ramp into. And then the new Magic stuff where it's like, well, we know that all that crazy mana ramp stuff is ridiculous, and we're not going to print Dark Ritual and stuff like that anymore. No more mana vaults and core sets. We'll just, but we do think we need to make creatures better and stuff, so they print all these ridiculously overpowered creatures. Well, it's like when you combine the two together, I mean, obviously it's just totally nuts. Uh, yeah. So, oopsie. So, yeah. What ends up happening? There's also all sorts of Tinker decks in the top eight. There's the George W. Bosch, which we'll get into. And then, of course, there's the Mana Severance Charbelcher decks. I mean, oh boy. I mean, there's just tons and tons of ridiculous stuff. And then, of course, this is from one of the articles going over some of the bannings from the mothership, talking about why they're banning and what the decks do and so on and so forth. But yeah, pretty ridiculous. So this was the deck that actually won. Yeah, this thing is pretty nutty. So you have like typically you'd have to have like more cards to like sack to Tinker or whatever. But due to the artifact way, it's great for an Asceta Synod. You don't really have to play any crap cards. Like, I mean, sure, if you have an extra Lightning Greaves or Voltaic Key or something, you can sack that to Tinker. But you can just play straight gas and not have to play any shit to enable Tinker, which was awesome. I mean, this is a super mega ramp prison deck thing, kind of combo-y thing, and it's resilient too with Goblin Welter. I mean, this was awesome. I remember playing this deck back in the day. Holy moly, it was sweet. I mean, man, casting Tinker, getting even just like a Gilded Lotus, it's like, oh yeah, this is it. This is it, fam. We're living our best life. Yeah, this deck was awesome. And so there was a lot of cards from Mirrodin, obviously, in the deck. So we saw Lightning Greaves. This, of course, worked very, very well with Metalworker. That was super fun. Lets your Metalworker, I mean, obviously, it's really fragile as a 1/2 artifact creature. So Greaves lets you, say, turn 1 Tomb, Ancient Tomb, and to turn 2 like land, Metalworker, and then you can Greaves up your Metalworker, tap it for a bajillion mana, just start dropping insane stuff. Some of that insane stuff could be even more mana, like Gilded Lotus. Um, and then even stuff like, for example, a Chromatic Sphere, which is a reprint from Invasion, was really good too, because, well, it was color fixing, which was really nice, or just a cheap artifact to sack to tinker, and of course it cycled, which was pretty sweet. Or, of course, you could just have it sit in your hand with Metalworker. And then Pentavis was, I know it seems like this 7 mana 5/5, like what the hell, right? But the nice thing was, the synergy with Goblin Welder lets you create a ton, like let you cycle Pentavis, so you would move a bunch of things and have like one counter on it, and then you could weld it out for like an artifact in your graveyard, or remove the last counter and it dies, and then weld out a Pentavite for the Pentavis, and so you'd be able to get like infinite flyers and then also big Pentavis and stuff like that. Really sweet. That was super fun. Yeah, it's pretty sweet. Most people probably haven't seen Pentavis, but I mean, obviously it's amazing. Who doesn't like Pentavis, right? One of my favorite cards. The card's amazing. All right, so in standard, like we were talking about earlier, um, Skull Clamp was a big thing. Obviously, we had the talked about the 3 big decks with Affinity, Goblins, and Elfin Nail abusing Skull Clamp. And of course, it even mentions at the German Nationals, top 16 was 58 out of 64 Skull Clamps. I'm not even sure the last time I remember anything even close to that kind of dominance. It's pretty ridiculous. I mean, what more do you even need to say? That's pretty crazy. But yeah, so this was a big thing. Obviously, um, the Affinity deck was pretty insane, but Skullclamp was just obviously the most egregious, obnoxious part of that deck. And then, of course, obviously, it was insane in all the other decks too. So they figured, ban Skullclamp, everything will more or less go back to normal-ish. This is one of the... I tried to find like a bunch of different Skullclamp decks because I don't really quite remember what was played, but this is one I found by Z Moshowitz from 2004, early 2004, before it was banned. And this looks not too strange. Obviously, it's attacked for the mirror with like main deck Oxidize and things like that. And of course, the sideboard is just more removal. But yeah, so this is the what the Affinity deck looked like with Skullclamp. But after it was banned, the deck was still actually very, very good. And so how it typically played was you have a bunch of cheap artifacts, so you have all your artifact lands. Well, I don't think it played all of them. I don't think it played the... Which one did not play? Was it Ancient Den? Can't quite remember. Anyways, it played some mix of artifact lands, other cheap artifacts like Ornithopter, Welding Jar, Aether Vial was also quickly added to the deck. And then the payoffs were, of course, like Ravager and a Tog. A Tog, of course, being another sack outlet for Disciple the Vault for the combo kills. Obviously, Ravager's a little better than a Tog. And then, of course, all your affinity stuff, like Frogmite and so on. And then Disciple, like I said, for your combo kills. And then Cranial Plating was the other big payoff from Fifth Dawn. And even did just silly tricks with when you got double black to equip it at instant speed. So yeah, so you get your Glimmer Void or your double Vault. I think that was the black artifact land was Vault or something or other. Anyways, yeah, so that was pretty much how the deck worked Definitely very, very synergy driven. And at the time when I was playing it, I was like, what am I? This deck plays Ornithopter? Is this a fucking joke? But it's actually good in the deck. Even stuff like Aether Vial at the time definitely confused me even more. I'm like, what the fuck is this? Like, what does this thing do? This doesn't do anything. I mean, at least Welding Jar, I'm like, oh, I can stop my Ravager from dying or something. But yeah, it definitely sort of really, at least for me personally, and probably for a lot of other people, really got the gears turning on synergy and card evaluation and how certain cards you can't really, look at them in a vacuum. Well, really any card because of the way they interact with the cards around them. So, yeah. Ornithopter looks pretty good when it's got cranial plating on it, or like six counters from Arcbound Ravager, right? Pretty sweet. So there was also, like I said, one of my favorite decks from Block was the Krark Clan Ironworks deck, um, which we already went over Krark Clan Ironworks. So let's go over some of the other cards in the deck that were made it so good in Block. First of all, we had a lot of good tutors, mostly just Fabricate specifically, but we have stuff like Serum Visions too. And even stuff like Condescend, which was protection, and then also dug to more well, your combo cards or whatever you needed. Condescend was really sweet. That's a good spell. And it played all sorts of artifacts, tons of different artifacts, of course, like all the artifact lands, and then Pentad Prism, and then the payoff, of course, was well, maybe not of course, but Mirror Incubator. I'll let you read that a couple times. Yeah, so what we do is you'd sack a bunch of stuff, play your Mirror Incubator, sack the rest of it, activate it end of turn, exile all of your stuff, and then you'd have you'd have like a pile of mirror, 20 mirror tokens or something, or only 10 or whatever. Um, and then you'd attack with them because you could do this in instant speeds. You do it at end of turn, and then you could sometimes kill with Fireball too if that wasn't enough because you'd be able to sack the mirrors to uh, Clark Clan Ironworks, and then you could Fireball someone. And yeah, this is a sweet deck. I had so much fun playing it. I should actually remake it. That was fun. Man, I love playing that deck. I think sometimes they also played like Goblin Charbelcher. That was another way to win too. You could fabricate for the Charbelcher. So yeah, that was really fun. Obviously, I mean, I think it's a lot more fun than the newer Ironworks decks, which were like more cerebral and took longer and just freaking kill me, right? So, like I said earlier, there are a lot of things that Mirrodin affected, and then perhaps none more so than the Eternal formats at the time, which was primarily just Vintage. And once we really got all of those things, we got all Fifth Dawn. So we got Trinisphere and Crucible and all sorts of other busted stuff. And we made this fucking monstrosity. So this was like 5 color stacks. Um, and it was, well, I mean, ridiculous. This was a pretty insane deck. I mean, I remember playing it. So, I mean, typically the stacks only wanted like permanent mana sources and just all permanents in general. But there were some things that were super strong. Obviously, all the tutors, which could find you your really good stuff. So you crop rotation for your Tolarian Academy, and then some other really powerful spells that netted you a bunch of cards. Things like Balance, Yogg's Will, Ancestral Tinker, stuff like that. And then of course there was it was teched for like the control matches with Chains of Mephistopheles. So obviously that punishes decks that want to draw a lot of cards or anything like that. So yeah, yeah, this thing was pretty insane. This is the last time, the last deck I could find that was legal where you could play like 4 Trinispheres before it was banned. It only played 3 main deck, like I said, because they'd be multiples weren't very good against control decks, obviously. So a lot of a lot of the interactions this deck was the stacks decks classically were built upon setting up a hard lock. So you have like you can have Crucible and Strip Mine or Wasteland, and this will let you basically cut down your opponent's lands or maybe even eliminate them altogether. Then you have stuff like Smokestack and Tangle Wires. Tangle Wire to slow them down. Smokestacks before Smokestack ramps up, gets a couple counters. And then of course Trinisphere going turn 1 Workshop. Trinisphere is just absolutely backbreaking. So unless they have a Force of Will, there's really nothing they can do for the next couple turns. And that's eventually what got the card banned, obviously. And so this sets up a hard lock. So if you have Trinispheres, Smokestack on 1, I mean, there's basically nothing your opponent can do, and they'll eventually just run out of lands, and you'll be able to, especially with Crucible of Worlds, just keep replaying a land to feed the Smokestack. So yeah, it's pretty busted, pretty insane. I mean, that was, really Smokestack, or excuse me, not Smokestack, but Trinisphere plus Workshop is basically a 1-card combo, and ended more games, perhaps, than anything else. At least, and it's easier than anything else to initiate, obviously. Just, you don't even need a Workshop. You can just have, like, a Lotus land and a couple Moxen or something, or like a Academy and 2 Moxen, or that kind of stuff. So yeah, totally insane. I mean, just this is my kind of deck. Totally soul crushing. And you when you hard lock them, of course, people will be like, okay, I can't win, so they can actually just scoop instead of like, ooh, maybe he'll screw up or whatever. Like, yeah, that doesn't happen. So yeah, this deck was insane. And it had like a Karn to win the game. A Karn. Yeah, good stuff. So, Skull Clamp. Yeah, this card. Let's talk a little bit about Skull Clamp. This thing got banned very, very quickly in basically everything. So in June of 2004, it was banned in Standard, and then also banned in Block Constructed. And then in Extended, it was banned in September. And then eventually it was also banned in Legacy in September too. Originally, this seems weird, but Legacy and Vintage had the same ban list, and then everything that was restricted in Vintage was also banned in Legacy. It was very, very weird. They were totally different formats, of course. So it didn't make any sense. So eventually in 2004, they separated the ban list and separated the formats, so there were their own things. And so a lot of the really broken, busted cards in Old Extended are banned in Legacy, as well as a lot of the more what's the best word I can use? Just some of the better, more powerful cards from Vintage are also banned as well. So things like Land Tax and Bazaar Baghdad, Workshop, stuff like that. And then of course the stuff from Extended that was too good. So stuff like Oath, as well as Replenish, things like that. So yeah, some of the stuff has come off. Obviously, some of these will never come off. We'll never see Bazaar or Workshop, of course, or Oath even. Some of these others might, but probably not Mana Drain, but who knows. Anyways, so this card very, very, very quickly became banned in basically everything, everything outside of Vintage, where it still does see play. And so you're probably wondering how the hell this card become to be, and of course most people are probably familiar with this story, but let's go over it a little bit. And this was a story about last minute changes and not testing the card. I mean, this should sound familiar, right? But at least here it's like somewhat understandable. Anyways, let's just drink a little bit, All right. So what ended up happening first they make it where it's like 3 to cast, 2 to equip. It gives the creature +1/+2, and you can sack the creature to draw 2 cards. They're like, we don't like this, so they changed it to +1/+2, and when it dies, you draw 2 cards. And it sat like that forever. And then right before, like what does it say? About months ago. Okay, so a month before everything had to be set in stone, they changed it to what we see now as Skullclamp, the 1 to cast, 1 to equip, +1, -1, draw 2. And apparently no one thought anything of it. Now, at least in their defense, this was a new card type. I mean, yes, we see it now as a busted card drawing engine, but back in the day, they're just like, well, might as well push this new card type, let's make it good. I mean, most of them didn't really do too much, right? So even stuff like that they probably thought was a lot better, like Sword of Fire and Ice and Sword of Light and Shadow, didn't really do that much until much later, of course, and combined with other cards from other sets. So, I mean, it's at least understandable. I can see how this, made it out. They just didn't test it as a new card type. They didn't really have any experience with it. Again, sort of the same thing with GT, not too much later. So I can't hold it against them that much, even though the card's totally busted. So yeah, I mean, this is what more can you say about Skullclamp? This is probably the most, I don't want to say, well, I guess you could say important, impactful, perhaps the most impactful card that came out of the set, at least in a lot of formats. Obviously, standard, block, extended, legacy, so on, modern eventually, where it's never been legal in modern and was only legal in standard and block for a short period of time. And it's arguably the most broken card in the last 20 years. Yeah, I think that's actually a pretty easy statement to make. I mean, there's stuff like obviously Oko, um, but Oko you actually have to play like blue and green, whereas like Skullclamp's cheaper and you can just put it in anything with creatures, but they're obviously pretty comparable. But then of course Misstep is the other one, Misstep, which was basically ubiquitous in a lot of formats, and I think all 3 of these cards were really like fundamentally warped formats around them. Um, for example, Misstep and a lot of formats like Vintage or Legacy more or less stopped. Like people thought it would kill certain like weenie decks or decks with cheap creatures or something, or like Delver or whatever. But actually wasn't the case. What ended up happening is that even decks like Goblins just played 4 Misstep to protect their lackeys and their vials, and all the blue decks like Delver and stuff could obviously play their own Missteps. Especially for like a tempo deck, this is amazing. And then if they didn't need them, they could pitch them to Force, shuffle them away with Brainstorm. But the one archetype that did suffer was Storm, and any sort of combo-based deck that really relied on 1-drops, which is basically all of them, right? Most of them, at least. So in Legacy, I mean, the Storm decks just weren't good at all. They were bad. They were really, really bad. They were unplayable. And the same thing happened in Vintage. And I think that's a better showcase of it. Like, look how poor Dark Ritual fared. It wasn't very good at all. And obviously Misstep caused all sorts of other problems in Vintage, which was only exacerbated by the format's particular quirks with like all of its mana ramp and things like Workshop and the artifact decks being not susceptible to Misstep, basically being immune, but Misstep being super important against the other decks, so it really fucked everything up. Like, really fucked everything up. Um, Whereas we just didn't really get that much chance to play with Skullclamp in a lot of the older formats that weren't Vintage, where Vintage isn't really exactly about that kind of thing. It wasn't really ever legal in Legacy. I don't really remember it seeing play in 1.5. Obviously, it was never legal in Modern, so how broken is it still? I mean, obviously, it's still totally absurd, but it's hard to say. It's hard to say. But it's probably easily one of the most broken cards. They've printed, like I said, last 20 years because A, it's colorless, it's extremely cheap, only costs 1 mana. It draws more cards than it costs to equip, and of course it has a shitload of synergy with things that die. So previously things like Goblin Bidding, uh, or I should say Patriarch's Bidding, and then Goblin Sharpshooter, Wireward Herald, obviously stuff like Arcbound Ravager and Disciple of Vault and things like that. So yeah, it was really, really powerful. It just kind of did everything, drew a ton of cards, and unlike Oko, at least, everyone liked playing with the card, at least in Standard at the time, which I thought was just kind of funny, you know? Um, Thinking back on it now, it seems kind of funny. At the time then, I mean, well, it's hard to say, but yeah, pretty crazy, pretty crazy. Um, but yeah, no, you can't really. I mean, I don't think anyone will ever say, "Oh, Clamp's not good." I think it's definitely one of those cards that's like, not only is its reputation, um, obviously preceded it, but it's obviously just completely busted. You know, it's an extremely powerful card, and you don't really need to convince too many people. So yeah, yeah, it's pretty good, pretty good. So overall, let's take stock. Mirrodin block really changed the way we looked at cards, literally, because of the new card face, and the way we built decks, especially in older formats. Um, Very quickly after Mirrodin came, uh, you really saw the disappearance of like the old school, um, like monocolor weenie decks, things like that, and a lot of other old school decks just sort of went out the window too. Stuff like Parfait, things like that weren't as good. This is of course also due to things like a Storm being introduced in just the set previous and Scourge, and so that really changed the way people. And then of course stuff like Psychotog too, which was a couple years earlier, but is got even more powerful in places like Vintage. But Mirrodin, I think, is more really like the high watermark of like when everything changed very quickly, all at once, and it was a new era really, in the way that Wizards like develop cards, um, and we still had a lot of the old art in some stuff, but some of the definitely the new card frame, and definitely we got a new art direction too. So we're not going to see any more Foglios, stuff like that, and then new storytelling too, because this is Mirrodin is like the first time we aren't on Dominaria. So even after Apocalypse, Odyssey block and Onslaught block were on Oteria, which was again still on Dominaria, so it's still familiar. But Mirrodin was a completely new set, and originally we didn't even know that uh, Mirrodin was actually made by Karn, obviously from Dominaria and the Weatherlight Saga and all that stuff. So this is really, we start seeing new blocks, new sets. So the set after this, of course, is Champions block, which was Kamigawa and all that good stuff. And then after that, we have Ravnica. And thankfully, Champions and Ravnica was an incredibly awesome, one of the best times, I think, for Standard, just because you could play all sorts of different decks. The mana fixing was good. There's all sorts of different strategies. Nothing was too overpowered. That kind of stuff. Um, and yes, even like Ravnica Time Spiral block was really good too. Um, but yeah, we also see really powerful creatures, of course, if you look at the big fatties. I mean, we already went over a bunch of them. Stuff like obviously Darksteel Colossus, perhaps being the most emblematic of that, being extremely powerful. Um, and of course, all the really good new artifacts and artifact payoffs. Lots of synergy with the old stuff, A lot of the old cards, Tinker, of course, that we talked about, Ancient Tomb, all these sorts of things, Metalworker, very powerful. And this, of course, created a lot of problems in older formats. And this time we saw standard bannings for the first time in about 5 or 6 years, really. 6 years, I think, 98, 99. So, yeah, definitely a pretty tumultuous time. Um, and of course, this really marked the beginning of even more ridiculous changes. Then we had the Gifts and Given decks, which was from Champions block, and Vintage. Again, another really powerful combo control deck. Same thing with Thirst for Knowledge, of course. This was, again, another really powerful card drawing engine and artifact based decks. I mean, there wasn't much you had to do to build around it. You're already playing a ton of Moxen and things like that. Then, of course, we have Jite, which caused lots of issues in Kamigawa block and constructed too. Double, yeah. Speaking of block constructed, both Mirrodin block and Kamigawa block constructed were really bad formats. Not really very good, at least until Affinities was banned. But then there wasn't really much block constructed after a lot of the Affinity stuff was banned. But yeah. Then of course we get Dredge and Ravnica. Of course, shortly after this we have the 1-5 and Legacy, or 1-5 and Type 1 split. So Legacy and Vintage are split up. And then in the next few years, really we see the sort of extended seem to be never super popular like the way Modern is now, but it started losing a lot of interest in extended. So, and I think around 2010-ish was when they just stopped. We're just like, well, no more. And then for Vintage, the next couple years, 2007, 2008, we have massive changes with the restriction of Brainstorm and Flash and all that other stuff. And then, of course, the rise and fall of support for about 2002, 2003 to about 2007, 2008-ish, I think, for the SCG like Power 9 tour. Of course, we have the Flash deck and Legacy, which is one of the most busted decks in probably since the original Tricks deck. Yeah. So yeah, there's this. It started off really being like the seismic shift with Mirrodin, and then in the next couple years, and especially in older formats and stuff, we really see a lot of problems. But at least Standard itself seemed to recover okay from all the Affinity insanity. Thankfully, Ravnica was such a really good set, and Champions was a good set with Ravnica, but due to like the parasitic nature of a lot of the mechanics and Champions and Mirrodin, it didn't really work very well together. But Champions and Ravnica was one of the best standards ever. That was really, really fun. And of course, the drafting and Champions block and Ravnica block was really good too. One of the best formats I've ever played. Thankfully, we have all these good things that happened, because this is definitely one of the worst things to happen to the game since Urza's block. It was really bad. I still remember very vividly how at my local card shop there was a lot of people, and then suddenly there wasn't. And I didn't quite understand, because I just started playing only a couple years before, and I was still just playing random stuff, right? And apparently, I guess just people just didn't like playing the Affinity stuff, and they got tired of losing to it, and it was obviously way too fast, and obviously Skullclamp made that worse, and then they banned Skullclamp, but then comes cranial plating. So yeah, that was really, really bad. That was pretty unfortunate, and it never recovered. It never recovered to where it was. At least, I mean, at least 4 or 5 years after that, which is kind of unfortunate. I'm sure this isn't a unique story. A lot of other people experience the same thing. But on the bright side, Mirrodin was a very powerful set, and a lot of the cards that were too powerful then are good in a lot of sets. Obviously, all the stacks, lock pieces, the Trinispheres and Chalices and things like that. These are very important cards for Legacy and Vintage, even Modern to some extent. And so they're because the set was so powerful, we're still feeling its influence even today, with 12 cards actually banned in Modern, 5 of those being the artifact lands. So yeah, and that's kind of the nice thing, is that eventually, even though some cards are, I should say some sets are like extremely powerful things, eventually they work themselves into the fabric of the game in a way that they're good influences, at least in a couple years after some bannings. And there's still probably, like some cards that can't really take off the ban list, like things like Skullclamp and Modern or whatnot. But I think that these kind of really insanely overpowered formats are good for the game many, 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 many years after the fact. Not that like we need to have more Mirrodins, but they are exciting to play with these older cards, and they're exciting to talk about and think about, and that kind of stuff. So that's good for the game in some respects. So if there is any silver lining that the game has finally sort of caught up with Mirrodin block, at least in respects to, like, say, Affinity not being the most ridiculous thing, or at least being banned to death. Rest in peace, Darkbound Ravager. But yeah, I definitely liked playing uh, around this time. It was pretty fun. I like playing the big red deck with Slith Firewalkers and Arc Sloggers and stuff. But yeah, that was a long time ago, and that's okay though. It's just I'm just nostalgic, just nostalgic. But yeah, that's I think that's finally it. I think I finally got all that autism off my chest. I think I'm good to go now. So great. Let's well, just take another drink. So yeah, that's pretty much it, guys. All of my thoughts. I think that's pretty much almost every single thought I've ever had about Mirrodin. I condensed into about an hour and a half ish. So that's it, guys. So thanks for stopping by, and have a great day.